This is Sociology 40, Chapter 2, from Gender, Ideas, Interactions, Institutions, 2nd edition. Okay, so if we don't learn the idea of the gender binary by observing people around us, where does this idea come from? One of the main questions that the chapter's asking is, how do we learn the gender binary? It is a part of what's called the hidden curriculum of our lives, as we'll discuss. So it's taught and reinforced in so many aspects of our lives. If you've taken an introductory sociology course, then you know we have agents of socialization in our lives that create a great deal of influence over our development of ideas, values, beliefs, and even our identities. So think about the agents of socialization in your life. Who are they? What do they tell you about gender, about how you're to perform your own gender? Think of some of those agents of socialization. They could be your parents, your school, your peers, the media, etc., right? So these agents of socialization have a lot to do with how we come to understand gender in our current society. So what's interesting is the chapter discusses how we tend to use the term opposite sex when describing the relationship between men and women in society. Why don't we say other sex or different sex? Why opposite? Well, it's because it has a lot to do with our historical understandings of gender and sex. And language is very clearly tied to meanings. Language affects meanings. We shape the dynamics between men and women in a negative way when we see ourselves as opposite. It becomes a case of us versus them in a number of subtle and some obvious ways. So some of this obvious is when it comes to this kind of inferiority, superiority, personhood idea. So 17th century Europeans and early Americans believed in superior and inferior versions of personhood, where women were inferior. And I put this very upsetting picture from your book, Figure 2, over here, to show how they thought that women just had like inside out penises, basically, which, I mean, there's some amount of biological truth to the fact that like the genitals are composed of the same materials, but the idea is like it's definitely not like a complete inverse or an opposite in the way that people thought it was in the 17th century, right? They just thought women were these inferior people with inside out penises. And so obviously that's not accurate. So this opposite idea suggests that what one sex is, the other is not. And this isn't true, right? Male and female anatomy do have a lot of similarities and develop from the same fetal tissue. So our bodies are all human. They develop from the same blob of tissue that's modified to enable our sexual reproduction. So while it's not accurate to say there's only one sex, neither is it accurate to say that men and women are opposites. So how does the gender binary factor in? Well, even when it comes to gender understandings, men and women have more similarities than differences, and we both have strengths and weaknesses. So the gender binary argument argues that there are only two types of people: male-bodied people who are masculine and female-bodied people who are feminine. Because we tend to think in terms of a binary, just meaning this or that, right? You're male or female, gay or straight, right? These kind of weird binaries that we create make us think as a either or, when in reality there's much more nuanced difference and plurality. So we routinely group men together as if all of them are alike, and we group women together as if all of them are alike. And we'll talk about this as how it comes to, intersectionality. Meaning, does every man have the exact same experience? Of course not, right? And what's going to change that? Well, it has to do with our intersections. So we're going to discuss this much more in depth in future chapters, but just to kind of, tip of the iceberg, if you have a heterosexual, white, wealthy male, his experience may differ from a gay man of color who's disabled, right? They're both men under the social category of men. But because of the intersecting ideologies and the intersecting identities that affect us on a hierarchical scale, meaning we have a hierarchy about not just gender, but also about sexual orientation, about social class, about ability, about all of these different social identities that affect the way that we live our lives every day. So even if you just use two identities, like a male who's white, so they have the same, two white males that have the same racial group and the same gender, but one is rich and one is poor, their experiences are going to be very different. So this idea of trying to create monolithic groups and say all men this or all women that is really pedantic, and it's a problem because we like to think of things as really easy, this or that, right? And it's just kind of so we can make quick snap judgments about things. But that doesn't make it real, right? That doesn't make it real just because we're like, well, I figured it out. Everyone's this or that, the end. Life is much more complicated, and thank God, because otherwise it would be so damn boring, right? So we routinely do this, though, in the way we talk. So there's a lot of problems with that gender binary ideology. What's interesting about it, though, is that there's this also interesting concept of the personal exception theory. This is the tendency that people have to categorize people according to the gender binary and stereotype them, but a large number of us don't believe we personally conform to a stereotype. We are the personal exception, right? You're like, well, yeah, other women act this way, but I don't, right? Or other men do this, but I don't, right? Well, maybe they don't either, right? Maybe you're just interpreting a presentation of gender as to the authenticity of the person presenting it, right? When we stop and think about it, we realize many of the people we know don't fit into the stereotypes very well, right? If we say men are supposed to act this exact way and women are supposed to act this exact way, and that's all there is, there's only men or women, which again is not true, then it kind of creates this boundary across what activities are considered normative and appropriate for us. So, but again, just think about the people in your life. You know people that violate these things, right? Like, you know men that are compassionate. You know women that are strong. You know people that kind of violate those basic gendered assumptions we have. So we can become personal exceptions to the rule uniquely ourselves, feminine or masculine, but not always. But somehow we then still stereotype each other and assume like, nope, they're still part of the gender binary, I'm not. So it's interesting, you could probably think of a few ways in which you don't always fit the gender binary. Like for myself, I remember growing up and hearing that women are small and dainty and feminine and compact and such, and I was at the time like the tallest kid in my class. And I remember thinking, okay, well, how do you be dainty when every boy in the class is smaller than you, right? So it obviously also I was tall, so, and athletic, so they put me in sports, and being good at sports meant I was bad at gender, right? Because I wasn't appropriately performing what a little girl should be when I was a girl. So it's interesting how these kind of, social assumptions come to us from the outside, and we all have ways in which we don't quite fit the mold. And it doesn't mean that we're wrong. It means the mold is wrong, that the mold is too constraining, that we should allow people to have more kind of open expression of who they actually are, instead of feeling like if they really truly act like themselves, they will be stigmatized, they will be shamed, or even potentially face violence, right? So this whole gender binary construction does not accurately represent even cisgendered people, let alone people who are on the margins, or trans, or people who just transgress or challenge expectations of gender. So when it comes to gender socialization, it seems natural to us, but gender is socially constructed for us. Again, it just means it's not the same over time, and it's different from culture to culture. So gender is a logic that we manipulate, but it also manipulates us. So we do have agency to push back and to express our gender in our own way. Yet what we think is appropriate, or how we even experience our own bodies, have been shaped our entire lives through gender. Our socialization makes us so skilled at layering ideas about gender onto the world that we have a hard time seeing it for what it really is. We don't always notice when gender stereotypes fail to make sense, right? It's kind of this confirmation bias. We only see the things that confirm what we already think, but we tend to miss those that don't. So gender just really provides a social framework. It's a framework in which we can understand our world, but it's a very limited worldview. Okay, moving on to the binary of our bodies. So we categorize people based on bodies. Since we realize that we are more than bodies, our tendency to just categorize people based on bodies is flawed. There are situations where, well, it's actually interesting that there are many people who are born intersex, right? Meaning challenging this idea that there's only male or female. When we talk about male being XY, with, female being XX, there's actually quite a bit of variations when it comes to the genetic markers, as well as conditions such as androgen insensitivity, where people with androgen insensitivity are born with genitalia that doesn't fit the typical definitions of male or female, right? And people with intersexed bodies are living proof that not everyone fits into a gender binary that only allows for opposite sexes. People who are intersex remind us we take for granted that everyone is clearly male or female. And the path to this straightforward body often involves many complicated steps. So in our culture, it's very common. People are born intersexed at a rate that is higher than people that are born with cerebral palsy or people that are born with Down syndrome. And I'm sure you've heard of cerebral palsy or Down syndrome, but we do not talk about people who are born intersexed. Why? Why would we not talk about it? Well, if gender is based on biological sex, and gender is an organizing principle of our society that we use to divide people, how can we divide people if there's more than just the two, right? So what happens in our culture is a lot of children that are born intersexed, their parents are persuaded by doctors to have their babies undergo complicated surgeries on their genitals. Sometimes these go on from birth through young adolescence, where children have multiple surgeries that aren't medically necessary on their genitalia so they can fit the binary, right? It's really upsetting. There's this article I make my students read in my sexualities class at Cal State Fullerton that talks about how, talks to doctors that perform these surgeries. And one of the doctors, he said this quote, now it'll never leave my mind because it's so upsetting. He said, "It's easier to change the child than change society." So basically his justification for why he's cutting into infants' genitals is because, well, they gotta fit a category. And think about it this way. What's the first thing you ask someone if they have a baby? What's the first thing you say when you see the baby, when you encounter the baby? Is it a boy or a girl? What if it's intersexed? What do parents answer? So the social pressure can really lead parents to choose to do this kind of medical intervention, though intersexed advocates themselves argue that they should just let children be and then grow up and decide what they want to do medically. So California itself has put out a statement about why these surgeries shouldn't be done anymore, but they do happen, hundreds of them a day, every day within California. So we have to understand that this is an ongoing issue and it has everything to do with our social understandings. Okay, moving on to gender identity and gender expression. So gender identity is becoming a man or a woman within the United States today. This involves more than our physical development. Our gender identities are about who we feel we are in the world. How we identify might not be consistent with our societal expectations for our gender. Most people assume that one's body, one's gender identity, and one's gender expression will all line up, but sometimes it doesn't. So when it comes to gender expression, most of us also learn to communicate our gender identity through our appearance, through our dress and behavior. This is our gender expression. Our body's gender identity and gender expression did not always match. It's estimated that 1 out of every 100 people is intersexed, and more than 1 in 10 report feeling as masculine as they do feminine, or more gender atypical than typical. So when it comes to the 10% of people, the intersexed, we all know intersex people. We probably just don't know that they're intersexed. Some intersex people themselves may not know until a health problem emerges. So some conditions are chromosomal and others are anomalies or hormone related. So concerns about the consequences of violating the gender binary has also caused doctors and parents to choose those genital surgeries to help infants fit into a binary. Having a child who does not fit in concerns a lot of parents. But again, intersex activists argue that doctors should delay surgery until children are old enough to decide for themselves if they want genital surgery. The practice of choosing genital surgery for intersex infants continues because of our discomfort with the bodies we see as deviating from what we consider normal. Okay, moving on to transgender and nonbinary. This is another group of people whose gender identity does not conform to the gender binary, are called transgender. And some trans people's experience come from some form of, a discomfort with the relationship between their body's assigned sex and their social identity. So some trans people identify as men or women, while others identify as trans men or trans women. And yet others identify as non-binary, meaning that they are outside or between the male-female binary, which can also be described as being gender queer. So some trans people choose to change their bodies with surgical and hormonal treatments, while others do not for a variety of reasons. So when it comes to pronouns and identity choices, some trans, genderqueer, gender fluid, and non-binary people prefer pronouns he, him, she, her, while others prefer gender-neutral pronouns like the singular they, them, or ze, zer. So sometimes people change their gender identity as they evolve, or they are gender fluid, which means without a fixed gender identity. So there's so much plurality of difference than the kind of normative binary that we've been acculturated to our entire lives through socialization. So moving on to the 90%. The term cisgender is used to refer to male and female-bodied people who comfortably identify and express themselves as men or women. The idea of oppositeness in males and females helps to police the boundaries of femininity and masculinity by emphasizing the differences. So think about it. I'm sure you have some examples in your own life of people policing individuals whose behavior violated gender norms, or maybe even policing yourself. Like I remember growing up being told, sit like a girl, act like a lady, these kind of things, or hearing what my brother endured from some of his experiences of, man up, be a man, walk it off, things of this nature. And this creates very gender different worlds for us as we grow. So even when we look at physical characteristics where there is a clear gender difference, there's still a lot of overlap in male and female bodies. So male and female physical traits, such as height, hairiness, shape, strength, agility, flexibility, and even bone structure overlap much more than they differ. So cisgender people believe in the binary so much that they create difference by changing their bodies, their styles of dress, their physical movement to emphasize femininity or masculinity. So think of some of the ways that we manipulate our bodies to meet the gender binary expectations, right? Like think of it just for working out. What kind of ways do men work out versus the kind of ways that women work out, right? What is the goal? If the goal is to build muscle, right, that's usually going to be masculine. But if the goal is to be slim and thin, that's going to be more feminine. So women who lift weights are considered deviant. And men who, might just be runners or slim, and their activity focuses on being slim, they're going to be considered deviant as well. So we actually create the difference, like how we dress, the way we style our hair, or even, there's a lot of body maintenance expectations for women, like such as shaving your legs, which otherwise would be hairy, or armpits, which those things are very similar. Or, for women, it can be, putting on makeup, gluing on eyelashes, putting on nails, all of these kind of things that make us different, more so than we already are different. Okay, moving on to gender ideology. So ideology is just a set of ideas that's widely shared by members of a society that guides identities, behaviors, and institutions. So gender ideology is our widely shared beliefs about how men and women are and should be, and how they do and should behave. And again, remember, in our gender ideology in society, we don't even accept that there is anyone but male or female. So that's why it's interesting. The book attacks the binary and questions the gender binary, but often even the way that things are phrased within the book is still very binary, right? So, what are some of those reasons we want to embrace societal ideologies? Right? Well, we want cohesion. We want a shared sense of culture. We want acceptance. What is some of the dangers in shared belief systems? Well, we exclude those that don't, perform adequately. We exclude and we harass, and in the case of, trans people in our society, we murder people who transgress our expectations of gender or who step beyond the binary. So there's a lot of danger in that shared belief system. So the gender binary is just one way to think about gender. It's not the right way or the wrong way. It's just the way our culture looks at it. But there's many ways of thinking about gender, and we can see this when we look at other cultures and how they understand gender. So some societies or culture believe that there are more than just two genders, or maybe they see gender as more fluid. For example, the book points out that the Navajo have a fifth gender fluid category for a person whose gender is constantly changing. So they have many understandings of gender versus our very binary, one or the other kind of understanding in our culture. So some of these other examples in the book we'll talk about later in more in depth in future lectures, but just to understand that different cultures have different gendered arrangements, which really shows how gender is tied to our societal values. Okay, so talking a little bit about some of those different cultures and how they have different ways of seeing things based on their specific sociocultural histories. Each culture is going to conceptualize and define categories of sex and gender differently. So this also affects the role that non-binary people play within the culture. So some cultures have very strict rules that lead to the acceptance of what's called permanent sex switching. So sex switching occurs when people assigned biological female at birth become socially male. So there's an example in the textbook from Afghanistan, right, where biological girls and women were not allowed to leave their home without a male family escort. So these sex-switched children are accepted, meaning the child itself is called a bashapash that leaves the home as a male and attends to the family business, like getting groceries or doing other things that female family members are just not allowed to do. And when the child reaches puberty, she becomes a female again, and a younger sister may take over that, responsibility. So sex switching is not unique to Afghanistan. It's been found in various cultures throughout history. And this allows for fluidity and change, both functionally within society and personally within the individual. And when it comes to gender and genitals don't always determine gender. Our sexed bodies are real, but gender ideologies vary, which leads us to interpret our bodies and our feelings about them differently according to the social context. So we like to impose the binary on things other than our bodies as well, right? So think of how we gender objects, right? We gender animals. Like there's this weird thing where all cats, are girls and all dogs are boys, or just this kind of like weird assumptions that we have where you're like, no, or they wouldn't continue to breed and exist, right? But again, we do this with everything, like what kind of hairstyle you have, it can be gendered. You know what I mean? What kind of clothes you wear can be super gendered. So all of these kind of bizarre things that literally have nothing to do with it except for the meanings that we place on those social artifacts is what makes them real. Okay, so gender is a social construction, right? It's not a natural thing that exists outside of the cultural context. Just as we apply rules to ourselves and others in support of the gender binary, we also apply gender labels to objects, activities, and even ideas. So sociologists use gender as a verb. When talking about the process by which something becomes coded as masculine or feminine, that's what we call gendering, right? Associating things with a gender, lumping together masculine and feminine collections of things that are not necessarily connected, right? And this has a lot to do with our understandings of the gender binary, which causes us to falsely disconnect masculine ideas from feminine ones. And this makes it really hard for us to form connections between the two. So, if you think about in what ways might this disconnect be harmful to form connections between them, right? Like think of something, for example, like how do we gender something like strength or compassion, right? We've gendered strength to be male. We've gendered compassion to be female. So what does that say about parenting? Right? I mean, first of all, if you're pushing like a bowling ball of a person out of your body, that's pretty damn strong, right? But also, the idea that men can't be compassionate is very limiting. So any of these kind of binary ideas are incredibly sexist, right? To assume that women are inherently weak or that men are inherently, violent, these kind of things that we're going to unpack throughout the class. Our social understandings accept these things, but we understand that, this is a social phenomenon and not an actual inherent phenomenon. It has a lot to do with the way we've understood or interpreted the gender binary, which, the textbook kind of refers to as our gender binary glasses. The way that, these glasses basically help us see the world the way that other people around us do. But in a sense, it also preserves the gender binary by doing this. So we actively use these gender binary glasses to gender the world around us. And when we're trained to subscribe to gender norms, we find comfort in people that have the same views. So our socially trained brains tell us what gender is, how it should be expressed, and we favor those things with that same brain training. So our gender binary glasses give us cultural competence, which is a familiarity and knowledge of how members of a society typically think and behave. There are some aspects of society and the relationships between the people in them that are prescribed by our gender binary and our gender binary glasses allow us to see the world through those shared social lenses. So this gives us a sense of belonging and shared meaning. But how might the gender binary and gender binary glasses affect those who are new to our culture or whose worldview is different, right? They might feel stereotyped, outside of which are not accepted. So it's interesting when we think about these gendering examples. It's through associative memory, or the way our brains process and transmit information, to make these literal connections so that some ideas are just associated in our minds with other ideas. So an example of associative memory operating within a gender binary, is feminizing housework, but masculinizing yard work, right? Or the one I said before, basically like feminizing cats and masculinizing dogs. Or a perception that men are rational while women are just emotional, right? Or even this idea that men should be breadwinners and work outside of the home, and women should be caregivers and work inside of the home. These are all ways that we've made associative connections in our brains that have to do with this gender binary that we're socialized with all the time. And I'm sure you can think of examples of the way we gender other things or traits or ideas. And when it comes to stereotypes is another term for embedded associations. So stereotypes are fixed, oversimplified, and distorted ideas about categories of people. Since labeling and categorizing things are a huge part of socialization, stereotyping is as well, even when we resist stereotypes. Stereotypes are often based on real facts that become generalized to apply to an entire group, or get distorted, or again, oversimplified, making them not real. So our gender binary glasses allow us to view the world the way that people around us do, but they can also distort our vision. They can also, kind of give us an image of the world that reflects what we already think the world is. So ultimately, gender stereotypes fail to describe most of the people we know, including ourselves. So clearly they're not great, and they're not really that valid. So this is something we're going to unpack in the class, is that if you can understand in ways in which the gender binary doesn't fit you or your close friends or loved ones, then clearly you can see how maybe the problem is the binary and not the people themselves. So we're going to explore these understandings in future lectures and discuss the way that we can unpack or take off those gender binary glasses to look at the world in a refreshed way.